In the grim darkness of the far future, amidst the ravaged battlefields and forgotten corners of the universe, whispers of unspeakable horrors echo through the void. Welcome, brave souls, to a realm where fear reigns supreme, and the line between sanity and madness is but a fragile thread. Welcome to the twisted tales of Warhammer Horror. The Way of All Flesh, Jude Reed. I killed Conrad Langenbroek exactly 1 month before I married his sister. It was raining the night it happened, a cold, relentless drizzle that saturated the air and blurred the distant glow of the city's manufactoria. In Etterdam, there was nothing unusual about rain, but what was unexpected was the presence of my future brother-in-law at my door. "What do you want?" I asked. He barged inside without an invitation, water dripping from his greatcoat onto the cracked marble floor. "That's hardly a warm welcome, Niklas." I was on my way to bed. "What a very abstemious life you do lead." He sniffed, his nose wrinkling with distaste. "Well, if we're dispensing with the pleasantries, I'm here to tell you to break off your engagement with my sister." He pulled his gloves off one finger at a time and tucked them inside his coat. A square-cut emerald sparkled on his left hand, matching the jeweled hilt of his monoblade. It made the dagger on my belt look like a cooking knife. "And what makes you think I'm going to do that?" He favored me with a light, mocking laugh. "Honestly, Niklas, look around you." An expansive gesture took in the moth-eaten velvet curtains, the oozing crack in the cupola, the chipped banister that spiraled to the upper floors. Riedwelshof had once been the crowning glory of my family's ancestral estate. Now it was a crumbling relic that bled a continual river of Throna Gelt. I wouldn't keep Grox in a place like this. I seem to recall Aurelie knew about the state of the house when she agreed to marry me. A scowl flickered across his face as I spoke his sister's name, and I felt a momentary stab of satisfaction. "Out of interest, does she know about your little visit?" "Credit me with some discretion." Conrad's crisp diction dripped with scorn. "The problem is my sister thinks she loves you." "I see, and you know better, do you?" "I'm sure her notion of marrying a penniless nobleman seems terribly romantic. And I imagine you think you'll have spent all her money by the time she gets wise to you." Conrad's lip was curled upwards, his handsome face twisting in a sneer. "A very profitable alliance, I grant you that. The wealthiest heiress in Etterdam, the woman whose manufactoria supply servitors to anyone who's anyone in this city." He let out a derisive snort. "And a pauper with a name that hasn't mattered for 100 years. "I think you should leave," I said. Conrad took a step towards me. I moved back, and he advanced again, until we were standing face to face, my back pressed against the wall. "If you'd allow me to finish." His skin smelled of amasec, LO smoke, expensive cologne. "I've come into possession of some interesting information. Information that makes you an even less appealing marriage prospect than you already are, Graf Niklas van Riedveld. Except that's the problem. Rumor has it, you might not be the Graf at all." Blood rushed to my face. My father on his deathbed, cursing me for a worthless bastard. The unwanted byblow of one of my dead mother's many indiscretions. I ground my teeth against the escape of words I might later regret. I'm sure Orly's friends in the Adeptus Mechanicus could recommend a janitor who could prove your lineage, Conrad continued, assuming you'd be willing to subject yourself to their tests. My fingernails bit half-moons into my palms. Get out. Make things easy on yourself, Nick. Conrad shook his head with an air of gentle, rueful kindness. Do as you're told, and you can keep your empty title and your shabby old ruin. But my sister deserves better than you. He jabbed his index finger into my breastbone. Understand? For a moment I was silent, stunned by the sheer audacity of the man. Then somehow my dagger found its way into my grip, and Conrad was staggering back, his hands gloved in red, clawing at the ragged-edged hole in his throat. He opened his mouth, and a torrent of dark liquid streamed over his chin, staining his expensive collar crimson. A giddying sense of nausea swept over me, accompanied by the profound desire to have the last 10 seconds of my life back. Conrad reached out his hand, the confusion on his face making him look unexpectedly young. Then he crumpled to the ground with a long, bubbling wheeze. Rain dripped through the crack in the cupola. I swallowed down a mouthful of bile. Conrad? I stumbled back and sat down heavily on the stairs, unable to tear my eyes from the body. With one blow, Conrad had been transformed from a living creature into an inanimate lump of flesh, and I had been the one to do it. A leaden weight pressed down on my chest. My head spun, the walls closing in around me. Unbidden, the image of my brother flashed into my mind, resplendent in his officer's uniform. Had Peter felt the heaviness of guilt each time he had taken a life on the battlefield, or had repetition rendered the appalling deed unremarkable? It didn't matter. Peter had killed with the God Emperor's blessing. I was a murderer, and his justice would surely follow. Blood trickled across the floor, turning the cracks between the marble tiles into narrow crimson canals. I straightened my back and stood. There was a simple, honorable solution to this. I would send for the enforcers, confess my guilt, and what? Even if I could convince the provost marshal that Conrad's death had been an accident, I would save my neck at the cost of everything else. Reputation, marriage, and any hope of restoring the family name. A heavy price to pay for a moment's loss of control. Yet was I truly the one to blame? Conrad might not have attacked me physically, but he had come intent on my destruction all the same. I had acted only in self-defense, though no one would believe that. Throwing myself on the provost marshal's mercy would serve only to complete Conrad's work. No, I would have to hide the evidence, and quickly. No doubt Peter would have dealt with the body on his floor with the same easy confidence with which he sailed through his entire life, leaving me to stumble and botch at every turn. But the golden boy of the family was dead, butchered with the rest of his regiment in some futile off-world conflict, his body too mutilated to be worth sending home. This time I was the one in desperate trouble. If I was to escape this situation with my skin intact, I would need a plan. For the first time, I was grateful for the absence of household staff. I had no reason to think Conrad had been lying when he said he had been discreet about his visit. If I could find a way to dispose of the body, tonight's mistake might not cost me everything after all. I had no idea where to begin, but I knew someone who might. As the younger son of the family, tradition dictated that my career would be in the administratum. The Van Rietveld name had spared me the worst of the tedium, and I had settled into an uneventful post, tending the city's ledgers. The salary was barely enough to live on, even without the leeching shadow of Riedveldshof hanging over me. And so when Hannah Ullman had approached me with an offer of additional employment, I had been in no position to refuse. The ancient Vox unit in the study cracked and fizzed in protest as I lifted the handset and entered her private code, waiting for the click to tell me that the connection had been made. No one spoke, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing on the other end of the line. "Miss Ullman, it's Niklas van Riedveld. I keep your books." I had also been the source of some confidential administratum information that she had put to profitable use, but I still wasn't sure she would remember my name. If I was honest, I wasn't sure I wanted her to. Rumor had it that the last man to inconvenience her had been flayed alive and set alight on the deck of a barge. Graf Niklas. Was that the hint of a smile in Ullman's voice? To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure of your call? Not a problem with the accounts, I trust. No, not that. I swallowed down the painful lump in my throat. My fiancé's brother. He attacked me. He's dead. Who else knows? Her words were crisp, urgent. No one. He came here alone. And where are you now? Home. Riedveldshof, but I can... Lock the door and stay where you are. I'll send someone to deal with it. The hour that followed was the longest I had ever spent in Conrad Langenbrueg's company. I perched on the bottom stair like an uneasy gargoyle, never taking my eyes from the corpse at my feet. When at last the knock came, I leapt into the air and half tripped over the body in my haste to press my ear against the door. Graf van Riedveld. It was a man's voice, reassuring and calm. You've got a problem. We're here to help. Can you... I glanced down at the body. Can you go round the back, please? Tradesman's entrance, is it? A woman this time. Someone might see, I hissed through my teeth. Someone might already have seen. If you like, the man said. I opened the back door to a pair dressed in nondescript clothing. Nothing like the flamboyant gangers of my imagination. The man nodded to me with a workmanlike air, while the woman bypassed me entirely, following my bloody footprints through the scullery to where the body lay. Bit of a mess, the man said pleasantly. When I failed to reply, he joined his companion at the scene of the crime, examining the remains with the diligence of an enforcer. They stripped Conrad's body with well-practiced ease, wrapped it, and transferred it to an unmarked ground car in the orchard, then wiped away the carnage from the floor until no trace remained. Miss Ullman said to tell you she'll be in touch soon, the man said, as matter-of-factly as if he had just delivered a carpet. What will you do with him? The body, I mean. The canal, he shrugged. Lower City, the usual. The woman held my gaze as she slid Conrad's signet ring into her breast pocket. I didn't stop her. Priceless though the jewel was, it was nothing compared to what I owed for tonight's little escapade. Light was searing through the bed curtains when I woke, my mouth dry and my head pounding. I fumbled for my chrono, wondering how long I had slept, then jolted awake as I realized the hammering in my skull was coming from the front door. Halfway into my clothes, I remembered that running would do me no good. I had nowhere to go, and no money to get me there in any case. If I resisted arrest, perhaps a few bolt rounds would save me the humiliation of a trial. More likely, I'd be brought down twitching and drooling by a shock baton to face whatever cursory justice the governor thought I deserved. I lumbered to the top of the stairs, like a grox resigned to the slaughterhouse. "Nick," the voice at the door was light and curious, far from the augmented bark of an enforcer. My heart leapt. "Coming!" I rattled down the stairs two at a time into a hallway bathed in warmth and color. In daylight, the events of the previous night took on an unreal quality, something I might have dreamed in my drug-induced slumber. Aurelie was standing on the doorstep, just as her brother had done the night before, the morning light playing over her dark curls. Where Conrad had been angular and harsh, his elder sister was all soft sweetness. Her gentle face creased with concern as she looked up at me. Even through my panic, I felt a surge of love for her. "What's wrong?" I asked. "I was going to ask you the same thing." She smiled, though her expression lacked conviction. Her hands fluttered over each other like the wings of an unsettled bird. "I've been knocking for ages. You didn't answer." Overslept. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand and caught a glimpse of my chrono. Shit, I'll be late for work. "I won't keep you. Only..." Aurelie's teeth worried at her lower lip, scoring indents in her skin. "Conrad didn't come home last night. I know it's not all that unusual, but I started to worry." "I haven't seen him," I said, the lie jumping too quickly to my lips. A slow, sick dread was rising from the pit of my stomach. I forced a smile onto my face, leaned down, and brushed my lips to her cheek. "He can't be far away." "You're right. He's probably found somewhere more interesting to spend his time, that's all," Aurelie said, without conviction. "He'll be back before long." I imagined the dead man drifting, gray and bloated through the murky waters of the canal, his eyes and lips already gnawed away by rats. "I'm sure he will," I said, and hated myself for it. A week passed before the enforcers were willing to take Conrad's absence seriously. The fear I was being watched was like a noose around my neck, one that might snap tight at any moment. I found an old bottle of Calma, the one that had eased my father's suffering in his last days, and used it to buy a few hours of sleep each night. Even so, my dreams were fitful, restless, haunted things. The judder of knife on bone, crimson smears on a regicide board. The days were worse. Aurelie concealed her anxiety with brittle optimism, the shadows under her eyes deepening with each day that passed. The slow death of her hope was painful to watch, and I found myself avoiding her, citing the pressures of work and the last preparations for the wedding. Once we were married, I told myself, things would be better. Both of us would come to terms with Conrad's disappearance in our own way in time. And then the letter arrived. I had heard it fall only moments before, but already a puddle of filthy water was spreading across the floor. It was sealed with the Langenbrück family sigil, an eagle holding a cog in its talons, but there was no name or address. I snapped the seal. A murky odor rose from the paper as I unfolded it. Ink had bled across the surface, as if from 100 tiny paper cuts, but the words were still legible, still appallingly familiar. I had watched them appear 100 times beneath the autokill, one to be sent with every wedding invitation, a blank space underneath for the recipient to add their name. "I shall attend the wedding of Graf Niklas van Rietveld to Miss Aurélie Langenbroek. The bottom of the page was smeared with ink, the signature blurred to the point of illegibility, but the shape of the name was unmistakable. Conrad Langenbroek. Holding the letter as though it were the rotting corpse of a canal rat, I took it to the scullery and dropped it into the macerator. I watched the sodden gray fibers shred and clot and vanish, then armed myself with a mop to clean away the puddles of water it had left behind it, desperate to be rid of every trace of its presence. I told myself there was no need for this irrationality. It was a letter, not Conrad himself on my doorstep. I had sent the invitations weeks ago. Conrad had signed it before he had decided to confront me. No doubt the messenger had been delayed or forgotten the missive, only now realizing their error. I opened the front door and scanned the night for signs of movement. Outside was only the distant sulphurous lights of the city's manufactoria, glinting through the endless rain. But my eye fell on a smear of silty mud on the doorstep. It might, if I squinted at it from the correct angle, have been the edge of a footprint. I looked up again. Something moved down by the canal. I told myself it was nothing, my brain trying to make sense of random patterns of light and dark, but the longer I looked, the more solid and human-shaped it became. Fear traced a chill finger down my back. Something was there, and it was watching me. I slammed the door, fighting to steady the panicked thudding in my chest, torn between the desperate urge to shine a light into the shadows and dread of what I might illuminate. I fumbled my way to a decanter and poured a glass of amasec, the stench of stagnant canal water lingering on my hands. I gulped it down, and I poured another, this time adding a few drops of my dwindling supply of Calma. The toxwand built into my father's signet ring, a plain adamantium band, not half as flashy or expensive as Conrad's, made a chirp of disapproval. I reset its parameters to ignore the drug. Its machine spirit subsided into resentful silence, and my hands finally stopped shaking. As the sedative eased its way through my bloodstream, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with painful clarity. Only 3 people besides myself knew about the murder: my 2 helpers and Hannah Ullman herself. I had been a fool to put my trust in a criminal and not expect her to take full advantage of it. The letter on the doorstep, the shadowy figure in the darkness, even the faint sense of being watched that had haunted me since the night of Conrad's death, must all be part of her plan. Next would come the threat of exposure, though Throne knew there was little to blackmail out of me. I decided not to wait for her blow to land. Leaving Riedveldshof by the servants' entrance, I was careful to avert my eyes from the canal as I followed it towards the lower city. Violence was never far from the surface in Etterdam, and over the last few days it had boiled over in a spate of execution, style killings in the slums, which only served to add to my unease. I had visited Ullman's home once before, while handling a particularly sensitive series of accounts, and had been struck by the contrast between the filth outside the hab block and the understated elegance of its interior. An office had been prepared for me with an autoquill and enough recaf to lubricate the night's work, but I suspected that on this occasion her hospitality would not be forthcoming. The lower city seemed darker than usual, its streets deserted, every window shuttered against the night. The unmistakable smell of promethium singed my nostrils as I approached Ullman's hab, and to my astonishment, I saw that the building had been gutted by fire. The walls were charred, The windows shattered. The reinforced grills melted into their frames. When I placed a hand on the wall, it was cool to the touch. Whatever flames had burned here were long dead. A foot-thick bulkhead door that could have stopped a bolt around hung open in the smoke-blackened doorway. Inside, the promethium fumes were stronger still, and nothing was identifiable amongst the ruin of soot and melted plascrete. Fires in the lower city were commonplace, of course, but this one seemed rather more deliberate. Scratching echoed from the depths of the building. The crimson eyes of a pit rat glared at me. Then the creature scurried away into the darkness. I hurried out of the alley and headed back to the canal side, an unaccountable prickling at the back of my neck. None of this made sense. Someone, most likely Ulman herself, had destroyed every trace of her presence here, but if she was trying to blackmail me, then why would she make herself impossible to find? I risked a glance over my shoulder, but the streets were empty, the rain pattering into the canal like the tapping of minuscule feet. By the docks, the municipal gallows were a stark outline against the glow of the city. Two luckless souls dangling broken-necked from the crossbeam. The street lumens grew further apart as I made my way home. The canals that had once transported ore to Etterdam's manufactoria were now stagnant and filthy, obstructed arteries clinging to the city's living waterways. Fungal scum covered the surface, so thick you could mistake it for solid ground, except that nothing green grew near Riedveldshof. Centuries of mining had pockmarked the land with empty claims and hollowed-out quarries. And as the ore had dried up, so had the money. There were footsteps behind me. The prickling sensation returned to the back of my neck, and as I increased my pace, so did my pursuer, their feet keeping perfect time with mine. The path between the warehouses and the canal was narrowing. The footsteps closed now, still maintaining that maddening synchronicity. The air was thick with the reek of standing water. My hand crept to the hilt of my dagger, and I spun, ready to defend myself at the slightest provocation, only to find the path behind me empty. I took one hesitant step. The sound echoed into the dark. Had I been enough of a fool to flee the ghost of my own footsteps? I turned to walk on, but this time the footsteps anticipated my own, as though they were real and I the echo. I broke into a run, my breath coming quick and high in my chest, but the thin soles of my boots slithered over the rain-slick cobbles. My toe snagged, and for a moment I was weightless, and then the path rose up to meet me. I scrabbled to rise, slipped, and fell onto my back. Freezing rainwater, plastering my clothes to my skin. And there it was again, a robed and hooded figure, standing motionless in the darkness where the lumen light could not quite reach. "What do you want?" My voice was thin, full of childish bravado. I drew my dagger and brandished it at arm's length in a clumsy threat display, knowing I was no threat at all. The watcher moved towards me. It raised its left hand to point at me, and the sleeve of its robe fell back to reveal a familiar emerald gleam. "Merciful Emperor," I whispered. Conrad Langenbrück was dead. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name, but someone, something, was on the canal side wearing his ring. An imposter, it had to be, all part of Hannah Ullman's incomprehensible plan. And yet the lean, broad-shouldered frame and the imperious tilt of the head were unmistakable. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible, but there he was. The nearest lumen globe exploded, sending white-hot sparks raining down around me. When I opened my eyes, I was alone, and all that was left to do was to pick up my sodden carcass and hope my remaining shreds of courage would bear me home. The days that followed were filled with torment. Every shadow in the rain was a ghost, every noise the footstep of a pursuing specter. I resigned from the administratum with immediate effect, and immured myself inside Riedveldshof, burning my lumens day and night, with no concern for the cost. I cut off contact with everyone but Aurelie. When we spoke, she expressed her worries for my health, while I endlessly reaffirmed my commitment to our marriage. I found myself obscurely pleased that I had replaced Conrad as the primary object of her regard. When my wedding day finally dawned, it took a sizable dose of calma to steady my hands, long enough for me to dress. I cut a curious figure, corpse gray, caverns in the hollows of my cheeks, dressed in a doublet and breeches that had been at the height of fashion a generation ago. I decided to walk to the cathedral early to deprive the local harpies of the pleasure of seeing me arrive on foot, and waited in the narthex through the morning worship. When the sermon was finished, I knelt in contemplation at the altar and listened to the guests filing in, my eyes fixed on the shining Aquila, my mind racing. The wedding had been a beacon of hope in the preceding days, but now it had arrived. My muscles were rigid, my mouth bone dry. I found I was unwilling to look over my shoulder to check which of our invitations had been answered. The Pontifex Urba, resplendent in his gilded crimson cassock, began the ceremony, the high Gothic litanies rolling across me like clouds of sacred incense. The cathedral was incandescent, 1,000 jewel-bright colors gleaming through the glass ag windows. My skull ached. Aurelie joined me at the altar. She was draped in white, her gown encrusted with tiny nacreous shells that caught and refracted the light, so that it hung around her like an aurora. A diaphanous veil adorned rather than obscured her features, fine enough that I could see her exquisite profile and the tumbling curls of her hair. I caught her hand and squeezed it. With Aurelie as my wife, there was no terror too awful for me to endure. The Pontifex lifted the chalice, offering it first to Aurelie's lips and then to mine. The sanctified wine was rich and aromatic, but I thought I could detect a bitterness beneath that reminded me of the stench that had clung to Conrad's letter. I shall attend the wedding of Graf Niklas van Riedveld to Miss Aurelie Langenbrück. I lurched to my feet. The chalice clattered to the floor. Wine splashed the altar cloth, spattering Aurelie's gown blood red. The air was thick with resin smoke. The glacaic-tinted light smeared across my vision as I blundered down the aisles. "Conrad, I know you're here." I spotted him in a cluster of robed figures, his head bowed beneath its heavy mantle. I dashed to his side and tore back the hood, only to reveal a whirring augmetic eye, its human partner blinking indignantly, a priest of Mars. "Where is he? Which one of you is it?" I tugged back a second hood, and another, the lights blinding, the stench of the canal filling my mouth. A hush fell across the room. Aurelie was at my side, her face flushed, her fingertips clawing my shoulder. "Nick, please. I don't know what the matter is, but you have to stop." A murmur was spreading through the crowd. Every pair of eyes, organic and mechanical, were focused on the spectacle I had made of myself. I straightened my doublet, smoothed down my hair, tried to steady my shaking hands. "I'm sorry," I murmured. Then louder, so that the assembled dignitaries could hear. "Pontifex, please carry on." The Pontifex Urba glanced at Aurelie. I understood the unspoken question, as clearly as if it had boomed through his laudhailer. Should I allow this to continue? Aurelie closed her eyes, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. I held my breath. She nodded, and I gave thanks to the Emperor for her loyalty. I wish now that she had abandoned me at the altar. The rest of the ceremony was a mundane affair. Aurelie waited with me while the guests departed, whispering and gossiping to each other. No doubt our names would be on everyone's lips by morning, mine in scorn and derision, Aurelie's with gloating pity. As we walked along the canal side in the gathering dusk, my unease could hardly have been lost on my new bride. But no spirit chose to manifest itself. At least, none that I could see. Our homecoming was far from the romantic occasion I had planned, back in the first heady days of our courtship. Then, I had imagined the threshold garlanded with exotic, off-world blooms, candles flickering in their sconces, a trail of petals leading to the bedchamber where we would spend our wedding night. All of my plans had been washed away in the panic and dread of the preceding weeks, and Riedveldshof was the same shabby old relic as ever, lurking in the gloom as we approached. Aurelie was restless, slipping her hand away every time I tried to touch her fingers with mine. The day had taken its toll on her, too. Something was creaking in the dark, a soft back and forth, like the labored breath of a dying man. I wondered what shutter had come unhinged this time, but for the first time I didn't have to worry about borrowing money for repairs. "Welcome home, Grafen van Riedvel." The door swung open at a touch, unexpectedly unlocked. A mechanical failure, nothing more. I waved a hand to trigger the lumen globes. Nothing. "Old wiring," I offered, and Aurelie gave me a feeble smile in exchange. The air in the hall smelled stale and damp, lit only by the borrowed light that seeped through the dirty glass roof, glinting off something small and metallic on the floor. Aurelie caught it with the edge of her foot. Light flashed off emerald green facets. A ball of isformed in the pit of my stomach, my mouth suddenly too dry to speak. Shaking, I shepherded Aurelie to the bottom of the stairs, hoping beyond hope that her gaze would not chance to fall on the signet ring that somehow had found its way here. "Are you tired?" I asked. "Go up to bed. I'll reset the lumens. Then bring us up some amasec. We can toast our wedding, if you like." Her voice was soft, almost sad. I heard rather than saw the thing that moved in the darkness. A soft whispering scuff that might have had any number of mundane explanations. A pit rat from the cellar, or a bird that had flown in through the broken shutter and become trapped inside. But I knew it was neither. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I could hardly make out Aurelie's expression, but I thought she was frowning. The noise came again, closer this time. Something was in the house. "Go upstairs," I told her. "Why?" "Go upstairs and lock the bedroom door. I need to check. I need you to be safe. Please." She hesitated. "Nick, there's something." The sound came again, and still she was perched like an idiot on the bottom step. Why wouldn't she listen? My hand lashed out, catching her across the cheek with a resonant smack. She swayed, her hand flying to the blossoming red mark on her face, her eyes spilling with hurt, then set her jaw in an expression as close to anger as I had ever seen her wear "If that's what you want," she said. I kept my eyes on her until she was safely out of sight, already cursing myself. Once again, I had allowed the darkness to rob me of my courage. My weakness had made me a fool and a bully. I went to call after her, to apologize, but before I could form the words, something scraped across the floor of the hall. One of the lumen globes flickered into life. My breath caught in my throat. There it was between me and the door, a gaunt, dripping figure draped in a filthy pauper's shroud. A scream tore itself from my throat as the house plunged back into darkness. I bolted for the nearest room, the dining room, slammed the door, and struggled to swallow down my panic. There was no way to lock the door, and the massive banqueting table was too heavy for me to move alone. Something metallic scraped down the door, rasping like the talons of a warp-spawned atrocity in a firebrand preacher's sermon. "Please, Conrad." The words came quickly, flooding from between my lips on a tide of desperation. Blood pounded in my ears. "I'm sorry. I never meant to." The door opened. A warm gust of air blew into the room, carrying the thick stench of the canal, forcing its way down my throat like unwelcome fingers. "God Emperor, in your mercy, forgive me," I whispered. "I never meant to kill him." I closed my eyes. A minute passed. Another. The air had taken on the dusty emptiness of the tomb, silent except for my own rapid breathing. There was a soft hum, followed by a click, and through my closed eyelids I realized the lumen globes had reignited. With a superhuman effort of will, I opened first one eye, and then the other. The room was bathed in golden light, and the spirit was gone. I lumbered to my feet and staggered into the hall, intimately aware of the reek of sour sweat drying on my skin. The cracked mirror on the wall reflected a wide-eyed beggar of a man, but I was alive. The specter of Konrad Langenbruch had spared me when it might have dragged me screaming to the wall. Perhaps my remorse had been enough to stay his hand, or my desperate plea to the God Emperor had found an answer. It didn't matter which. I had been granted a second chance, one I had no intention of squandering. Aurélie had fallen asleep by the time I crept, still shaking into bed, so it was no surprise to find she had risen before me. I had slept deeply, refreshingly for the first time in a month, and I sprang from bed with the eagerness of a man reborn. The sound of Aurélie's singing drifted up from the floor below, like the lilting melody of a caged bird. "Aurélie," I called. "Last night. I'm so sorry." "Just a moment, Nick." Her voice was bright. "Wait for me in the dining room. I won't be long." The sun's warmth was a benediction, the vivid crimson of the glass egg bleeding across the marble floor as I crossed the hall and entered the dining room. The table was set for breakfast, a pot of steaming recaf in the center. I poured myself a cup, savored its bitter flavor, and settled into my chair to await my wife's arrival. A languid warmth spread over me, as if I had finished a hard day's labor. I let my eyes close, drifting into a pleasant daydream of our shared future. And then the door opened. I opened my eyes to a darkened room. The air was cold, full of the dank, moldering smell of the canal. When I tried to rise, the strength went out of my legs, and I only barely kept myself from falling to the ground. Another footstep. Sweat prickled on the back of my neck, dripping down between my shoulder blades, tortuous and slow. Something more than fear was freezing me in place, weighing me down like a warm, numbing anchor. Kalma. It had been in the recaf, while my tox ring sat in obedient silence on my hand. Is something wrong, Nick? Orly's face swam into my vision, but there was an edge to her voice that I didn't recognize. I wanted our first morning as husband and wife to be special. Ashamed to spoil the recaf, but I couldn't risk you running away. Not after all the trouble I've gone to. A figure in dripping robes was forming out of the shadows, one arm raised, the sleeve of its robe falling away, to reveal tattered gray flesh and a pointing finger. Behind you, I managed. Orly reached out a hand and pulled back the sodden hood. Conrad's face was corpse gray, bloated and waterlogged from his long immersion in the canal. His lips and eye sockets were gnawed to the bone, while the ragged-edged knife wound in his throat gaped like a second mouth. The fine cheekbones and the high-bridged nose were unmistakably his, but the head sat on the neck at an angle that was uncannily wrong. Panic locked a hand around my chest and squeezed, while a dull roar filled my ears like distant rushing water. I tried to form words, but my tongue was stuck to the roof of my mouth. The apparition took a step towards me, and light glinted on two dull metal plates on either side of the ruined throat. Fat metal cables snaked from the rear of its skull to disappear into the robes, while dim red lights flickered into life in the eyeless sockets of its face. It was a servitor. Servo motors creaked and whined as it took another step, its feet slamming into the marble like the thudding of a crypt door. The stench of decay flooded over me, so strong I could taste its sour, cloying sweetness in the back of my throat. I tried to turn away, but Aurélie was too quick for me and forced my gaze back towards the dead man's face. Look at what you did, Nicholas.
The servitor towered over me, bulkier than Conrad had ever been in life, a grotesque puppet, given the merest semblance of life. Red, glowing orbs bored into mine like the eyes of a hellish
abomination. The thing that had stalked me all this time had been no apparition, no shade from beyond the veil, but an all too real construct of decaying meat and rusting metal. Yet somehow, the truth was worse than all my fevered imaginings. This close, I could see every tear and tatter in Conrad's mottled skin, each abrasion laying bare the muscle and sinew beneath, ripe and repugnant as rotting fruit.
The awful death mask filled my vision, devoid of all life or animation, a travesty, a mockery of the living man I had known, and worst of all was the thought that some remnant of his consciousness might still exist, trapped inside that soulless, rotting corpse. No words for your brother-in-law, Nicholas. Orly's voice was sharp. Gone was the downturned face, the deferential inward curve of her shoulders. This woman stood straight, her eyes so cold they burned, her once yielding lips set in a hard line. Never mind, I have them for you. She touched a metal stud on the cadaver's neck, and a hidden voxcaster beneath the shroud crackled into life. God, Emperor, in your mercy, forgive me. The voice, my voice, was a high, anguished bleat. I never meant to kill him. By all means ask for the God Emperor's forgiveness, Aurélie said, but don't expect mine. I swear to you it was an accident. My lips felt thick and stupid, enunciating every word a battle. He said he would ruin me, expose my parentage. I love you, Aurélie. The thought of losing you, I had no choice. Her open palm slapped into my cheek. I loved you, not your title. If you'd told me, I wouldn't have cared. And instead of trusting me, you killed my little brother. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she wiped them away before they could fall. You thought I would believe whatever lies you told me. I had underestimated her. I saw the determination in the set of her jaw, the steadfast hatred in her gaze. She had never resembled Conrad so clearly before. The enforcers were useless. It took the Mechanicus and me a long time to find him in the canals, but none of us slept until we did. Then it was just a question of finding out who had killed him. I tried again to stand, but my legs once again refused to obey. Did you know there are 12 pawnbrokers in the lower city? I found Conrad's signet in the third one I tried. It only took a few thrones for the filthy little woman, who owned it, to tell me everything she knew. Your friends gave you up so easily, Niklas. I didn't even have to show them my needles. But why? I tried to reach out to her, but succeeded only in sending the dregs of my recalf crashing to the floor. Why have the Mechanicus make a servitor out of Conrad's remains? Why have it stalk you, haunt you, convince you he had risen from the grave to torment you? Her mouth twisted, wry and bitter. For your confession, of course. I should be grateful you broke when you did. I almost lost my nerve last night. Poor Conrad. I've kept him from his rest long enough. The world was filled with the heady scent of recalf, sacred machine oil, and the sweetness of corruption. Conrad was right all along. He knew what you are: liar, coward, murderer. Her words hit me beneath the breastbone, driving out what little breath I still had. My eyes blurred with tears. I was too weak to blink away. Don't look so pathetic, Niklas. I won't let you die, not yet. I need you alive for your trial. And once you've hanged for what you did, they'll release your body to me, to lay to rest in the family crypt. My wife leaned close, so close that the heat of her lips burned against my ear. Her whispered words, dripping with vicious satisfaction. But I can find a better use for you than that.